Hello and welcome to the 50th episode of Two Guys and a Chainsaw. I'm Craig.
And I'm Todd.
And today we thought we would try something a little special since it is our 50th episode. Since we started out with Wes Craven and since we have done a couple of Nightmare on Elm Street movies already, we thought it might be fun to take a look at 2003's Freddy vs. Jason. Like I said, we've done a couple Nightmares before. We've never really done Friday the 13th yet, but we've referenced both franchises many times. And I thought this would be a fun one to do for the 50th. Todd, you had never seen this before, right?
That's correct. I don't know this. I would think I was in Japan at the time when this came out. It was 2003. And so this one kind of flew by me. I have to say I was not as excited about seeing the Freddy vs. Jason crossover as I think a lot of the fans were. I know that this film has been in the works for quite some time, since the mid to late 80s actually. But I don't know, for me, this whole idea of taking two people from these different franchises and pushing them together, kind of like Superman and Batman or like a comic book stars, takes a little bit away from the idea that they exist in what I consider to be two different worlds. Though technically they really don't, right? They both exist on Earth. One's in Camp Crystal Lake, one is on Elm Street, but it can be argued that, they're still terrorizing people in everyday settings. So it makes sense, maybe more so than a lot of comic book franchises, to put these two people together. But in the sense, for me, it kind of takes a little bit away from it. It kind of really acknowledges, I guess, what's obvious to anybody anyway, and that these two characters are really larger than life. They're really characters. They're really the superheroes of their own horror genre. And so something like this was bound to happen anyway.
Yeah, well, I come from the other camp that you're not in. I was one of those fans who was really hoping for this crossover. The Friday the 13th movies and Nightmare on Elm Street movies were events for me as a kid. I mean, these, in my opinion, are kind of the two biggest horror icons of our generation. I mean, of course, there's Michael Myers and Leatherface and Pinhead and lots of other really good characters in the world of horror from the 1980s and 90s. But these two were really just the be-all and end-all for me. When a new Nightmare sequel would get announced, I would look forward to it for months until it finally came out. The Friday the 13th movies for me were kind of more of a video store thing. I didn't see them in the theaters so much, but as soon as a new sequel popped up on the video shelves, I would rent it right away. And so the announcement of this crossover was something that really excited me. I had known that it had been being thrown around in Hollywood for a long time. Initially, the obstacle was that the rights were owned by two different companies, and so they didn't know how to get past that legal stuff. Eventually, Paramount bailed on Friday the 13th when they stopped being lucrative, and so the rights were available, and people, this movie went through dozens upon dozens of scripts and incarnations before it actually came to fruition in 2003. And when Paramount first dropped the rights, they were excited to do it. But right around that same time was when Wes Craven made amends with New Line, and he didn't really have any interest in doing a crossover, so they went with New Nightmare instead. And so it wasn't until 2003 that we got this, and I was in the theater opening weekend with my dad to see this movie. And I remember coming out of the theater thinking that was pretty good. I don't remember being super stoked about it. And since then, I've not really watched it. I've not really rewatched it in its entirety a lot, but it gets played on cable quite a bit every once in a while. And so I've caught bits and pieces of it here and there, and I'll sit and watch it for a little bit, if it's on, but I've never sat really and watched it from beginning to end until again today. And I got to say, I thought I came out of it this time, and I think that it's because this time I was watching it with a more critical eye. I actually came out enjoying it and thinking that it was a pretty solid effort. Not perfect, but I thought that they actually did a pretty good job of believably entwining these two franchises in a way that didn't seem entirely forced. It felt kind of natural for these two to exist in the same universe, at least for me. And like I said, it's not perfect. It's got its flaws, and I'm sure we'll highlight those as we talk about it. But I thought it was a pretty solid effort. What did you think?
I agree with you there. And as I said before, I think these kind of things are rather silly, but they really avoided getting too silly with it just because, you're right, they managed to bridge those two worlds in a more believable way and not a cheesy, corny, weird way. I was really curious how they were going to put these two characters together. And really, as it turns out, it makes sense that it's Freddy versus Jason instead of Jason versus Freddy. Because although we get a good bit of both of them in this film, probably pretty equally, and they're pretty equally matched, Freddy is the instigator. From the beginning, we have a voiceover where Freddy is talking and basically describing his plan, and his plan is that, and it's almost shades of New Nightmare in a way, where it takes this idea that there's a lore that has to be continued in order for the character himself to have power and to exist in this world. And I thought that was an interesting touch. I mean, it goes in a slightly different direction with it, but the idea is a little bit the same, and that is that Freddy has been so forgotten on Elm Street that he no longer has power. He can't come and visit the kids because the town has been so successful at suppressing the memory of him that he can't come back. And so he says he scoured the pits of hell in order to find someone who he could send back to Earth to rekindle the memory of Freddy, and he finds the perfect person in Jason, and he comes to Jason as his mother, and I guess this is the Jason that's like lingering around in hell or something.
Yeah, I guess.
Going through memories of kills and killing people and pretending to kill people or whatever, which was interesting, and comes to him as his mother and says, Jason, you've got to go back.
Do you know what your gift is? No matter what they do to you, you cannot die. You can never die. You've just been sleeping, honey. But now, the time has come to wake up. Mommy has something she wants you to do. I need you to go to Elm Street. The children have been very bad on Elm Street. Rise up, Jason! Your work isn't finished! Hear my voice and live again!
And his mother transforms, and we see that his mother is actually Freddy, who's convinced him to do that. That was really an interesting idea, quite honestly. And I'll have to admit, it did work.
I think so too. That opening sequence, I remember being in the theater, that opening sequence was really exciting because I knew, they were showing all of these flashbacks from the other Nightmare films. It made me happy to know that they were going to acknowledge the previous films and that really was going to be a continuation. And then when it jumps to what appears to be a very typical Friday the 13th scene with a young, beautiful, topless girl, skinny dipping in the lake and then getting chased by Jason, it just felt very genuine, at least in terms of both franchises. And then when you get the crossover where it turns out that this is actually like Jason's hell dream or whatever, and Freddy's able to appear to him there, I thought it just worked pretty seamlessly. It was cool to, again, acknowledge the character of Mrs. Voorhees because she's really the one that started the whole thing with the Friday franchise. They tried to get Betsy Palmer back to reprise her role, but she felt that the role didn't have enough substance. It wasn't big enough for her, and so she didn't come back. She had kind of done the same thing with Friday the 13th Part 2. They had wanted her to reprise her role in that movie, but she wasn't satisfied with the money that they were offering, so she never reprised her role, which is kind of unfortunate. It would have been cool to see her in this film, even in that small cameo. But yeah, I thought that, you get that, all of that stuff, all of that exposition explaining how these two worlds are going to be crossed happens in like the first 5 to 7 minutes. And then we're just thrown into this new movie. And it feels, while there are tons of references to and homages to both franchises throughout the whole movie. I mean, they just abound. It also feels like its own separate thing, kind of like a sister piece or something. And I thought that was really cool. And after that initial introduction, then we are thrown right into the thick of the movie where we see Jason appear on Elm Street, and you get the mix of those two iconic scores with the Jason's kill, 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 and the Nightmare on Elm Street kind of lullaby song, and they put them together, and it's just, I don't know, as a fanboy, it just made me kind of giddy. And then we get right into meeting these teenagers who we know are going to be the teenagers who are going to have to put up or face off against these two villains. And I was in it. I was invested from the beginning.
Yeah, and that's one thing I think that the director Ronnie Yu, I think he did Bride of Chucky before this, and a number of films in China. He has been a fan of this kind of film for a while, and he seems to be the perfect guy to do it because he managed, as you said, to really give you the flavor of both movies in the movie. It's really interesting how there is I guess for lack of a better word, there's a Friday the 13th aesthetic that gets injected into the Elm Street universe so that... Mm-hmm. The Elm Street universe is this sort of normal neighborhood that you can walk around in and be safe in, and more or less. But then when you fall asleep, it becomes this sort of nightmarish place. Or just in the heads of kids, it turns into a nightmare. And we have this alternate universe that we see a lot in the sense of the broken down Elm Street and the girls jumping rope and whatnot. But what we got here in the beginning with these kids in the Elm Street house was definitely more of the Jason aesthetic, where the outside is dangerous, where it's dark, and where he's stalking them from outside. And it felt very much like a cabin in one of the Friday the 13th movies. I mean, that's just the sense that you got from the way that it was shot and the way that it was portrayed. And I thought that was very skillfully done, quite honestly. I guess the kids in there are Laurie, who's the somewhat virginal, needs to meet a gal. You have Kip, who is the girl who's a little wilder, who's smoking at the beginning and talking tough.
Gibb is played by Catherine Isabel, who I just absolutely love. She's one of my favorite actresses in horror today.
She did a pretty good job in this one. And Kia, almost the token minority in the movie, I believe is a member of Destiny's Child, right?
Kelly Rowland.
Kelly Rowland. And honestly, I'd have to say of all of them, she was definitely the more amateur actor.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that this was her first movie. I don't know if she had done any other acting before, but it was kind of her first movie. And I've read that since the release of the movie, she's gotten a hard time from a lot of interviewers and things about her appearance in this movie. But she's always said that she had a good time making it and it was a success, so she has no regrets. Yeah, I mean, you can tell that this is not her cup of tea necessarily, and that's it's fair. It's her first movie. She's an amateur, and she holds her own. Her acting isn't so poor that it pulled me out of the movie.
I think more than anything, it just sort of exposed a little bit of the silliness of some of the dialogue.
Yeah, sure.
More than anything. But the three of them are in the house and they're chatting and discussing what they're going to do. It's Laurie's parents' house, and they're out of town, and so. And
it's the Elm Street house. It's the same. It's the same. Well, it's actually not the same set piece because they filmed it in a foreign country, but it resembles and is meant to be the same house from the entire Nightmare franchise that was originally Nancy's house in part one. And I liked that too. Just all these little, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's fan service, all of these connections to the originals, and I appreciated that.
Well, and it's fan service, but it's also fan service to the point. Like, it's actually integral to the plot that this be the original house. Because when Jason visits them, there's a guy named Trey who comes over, who's the jock guy, who's, I guess, hooking up with Gibb, and then Blake, who's his companion, who's a little more suave, but not quite.
Right.
Low key, who's trying to hook up with Lori in a sense, and Blake is Trey is the first victim. It's important because once Trey is killed in the house in what is a pretty brutal scene, very brutal. In fact, that is another way I think that the contrast between Freddy and Jason is most obvious. Whereas Freddy is almost like a craftsman in a way, I think. Like he's imaginative, and the ways that people die in his films I don't know, I guess you could say are a little more artful.
Yeah, well, he's more sadistic. Like, he takes pleasure. He has fun with it. It's almost like a game to him, whereas Jason is just this lumbering, killing force who, I guess initially revenge was his motive, but now it just seems like it's just kind of, this is what he does.
Yeah.
And yeah, that first kill is brutal. Of course, Gibb and Trey have sex, which is, the big sin for Jason. It's going to get you every time. Trey first gets stabbed all the way through his body and all the way through the bed. You see the machete coming out through the bottom of the bed too, multiple times before Jason then just folds the bed completely in half, breaking Trey's back in the process. And yeah, it's really brutal. And I liked that it set the tone for that kind of brutality. I read that New Line initially thought that it was too brutal, and they wanted it reshot or cut. But the writers were adamant that they thought that it would work, and so they left it in. And I guess that's like the most talked about kill in the whole movie.
It is brutal, and it's funny because we've come a long way. I know that the earlier ones in the franchise really had to do so much cutting that oftentimes the gore effects, which were really good, were only flashed on screen for like a minute or two.
Right.
And that's what they had to do to get an R rating. And this movie, if held to the same standard, would be unreleasable with the amount of gore and brutality. Actually, I was thinking it has to be the most brutal of the Friday the 13th movies in that sense. Don't you think?
Probably, yeah.
I mean,
I would guess so. There have been so many of them, and it's been so long since I've sat and watched all of them. I don't remember a lot of the details, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And that wasn't just the case with Friday the 13th either. Wes Craven famously butted heads with the head of the MPAA and the ratings board, and all of his movies, he had to make serious cuts, and he was never happy about that. But you're right. We clearly have come a long way because we can get away with a lot more.
Yeah, and so of course he's killed, and what that does then for the cops who are visiting is it's shades of Freddy, but they don't say Freddy. There's a new cop kind of on the beat, and he's just moved into town not long ago, and he's the one who gets there first. And then I'm sorry, I say cop, but it's the sheriffs and his deputies. And then the sheriff comes in, and he seems to know right away that this seems like Freddy is back. But he won't tell the younger cop anything about Freddy. He won't even say the name, but he seems pretty convinced that this is what it is. And so now you get that suspense like, oh, somebody's remembering. How much remembering is it going to take before Freddy can come back into this world? So it's an interesting conceit that you get Jason to come in and do a killing so brutal and so unusually, kids folded up into a bed.
Right.
And in the same house on Elm Street as before, that it rekindles these adults' memories and makes it almost impossible for them to suppress the memory of Freddy, which, as we find out, they've been actively trying to do, because I guess that is what has been effective at keeping him at bay. If you don't know who Freddy Krueger is, he can't appear in your dreams, right?
Yeah, and so what they've done, what the town has done, is any of the town's kids who knew anything or had been affected by Freddy, they have been taken off to Weston Hills, which is an institution. It's the same institution where Freddy was conceived and born. It's the same institution from Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, the Dream Warriors, where the kids were there. And what they've done is they've taken all those kids there and kept them segregated from the rest of the town, and they've been giving them this drug, Hypnocil, Hypnocil, which, again, we were introduced to in part Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Nancy was taking Hypnocil and got the institution to give those kids Hypnocil because it's a dream suppressant. And so that's how they've effectively wiped Freddy's memory from the entire town, except for some of the adults. And so when Laurie is outside her house and all the cops are there, one of the lower deputies does mention Freddy's name.
We need to lock this down now. Keep it contained. You hear me?
Killed in bed? Jesus. It's even the same damn house. 1428 Elm. It's gotta be him, right? It's gotta be Freddy Krueger.
Hey, don't even say that son of a bitch's name out loud. Let's just keep it together. We've been through too much to let this thing spread now.
But Laurie heard it. And so she wants to know, who is this guy? What is going on? But the cops won't tell her, even when she's in the police station, and they're talking to her, and she's saying, she just wants to know what's going on. The police have asked her all these weird names about dreams, but they won't. Or weird things about dreams, but they won't tell her anything. And that is when she's sitting there trying desperately to remember what the name was that she heard. And she's leaning on the table in the interrogation room, trying to remember. Finally, she opens her eyes and says, Freddy. And I thought that it was such a cool conceit that just having the idea planted in her mind and knowing his name was almost enough to allow him to break through. And immediately she is in a Nightmare on Elm Street dream sequence, very typical of the Nightmare on Elm Street dream sequences, where it's really spooky. She's walking through the police station. There's a bunch of posters for missing kids on the wall. As she walks by, they all follow her. And she hears this little girl crying, and she goes to her. And the girl says, it's Freddy Krueger. He likes little kids, especially little girls. And she turns around and her eyeballs have been slashed out. And of course, Laurie is scared. And the little girl says, it's okay to be afraid. We were all afraid. Warn your friends. Warn everybody. So, it's like Freddy wants and needs her to go out and tell her friends about all of this so his power can continue to grow. And I really thought that was a really clever thing. And that, in the realm of reality that the movie is set in, a really smart plan.
Yeah.
Like, of course she's going to tell her friends. And so I appreciated that.
Then we get a jump to Weston Hills, where we meet Will and Mark. Will is a kid who's had some interactions with Laurie in the past. She referred to him earlier as someone when she was 14 that she had kind of a little relationship with, and then he just left, and she didn't really know what happened to him. Obviously, he's been institutionalized because he saw something. We find out later he saw what he thought was Laurie's dad killing Laurie's mom. And so anyway, he's in this institution along with Mark, this other kid, and Will sees on the screen behind him, behind one of the desks where he's getting his medication, the news that something has happened in that Elm Street house, and that gets him all worried about Laurie because he knows that she lives there, and so even though they can't remember Freddy either, he does worry about her. And so he and Mark end up breaking out in what has to be the easiest way possible of this place, commandeering his van. Is it his brother's van or something that's all tricked out?
It's his late brother's van. Yeah, it's this goofy, like, I don't even know, 1970s black lights in the back, some big mural on the outside. It's funny.
That's right. And they go to find Laurie, and they appear in the school to them and say, be careful. But Mark seems to remember more, and he knows something is up, but he doesn't know quite what it is. He's the more skeptical one. He's like, look, we've been given all this Hypnocil. There's clearly something that they're trying to keep from us, but we just can't remember what it is. Is it that he starts to come back to him, or that he starts having the dreams too? How does that work?
Well, it seems to me, I love that scene in the school, because you have those three girls. You've got Laurie, Kia, and Gibb all in school. And of course, they're very upset about what's happened. Not only was there the first murder, but we also skipped over a scene where Freddy appeared to the other guy who had been there with at their little gathering, Blake, and Freddy appears to him and kind of lunges at him, but doesn't really have the power yet to kill him. So he allows Jason to do it. And so another one of their friends has been killed over the night, and that guy's dad, both. So they're obviously upset, and they're in the middle of the hall. It's a busy hallway, and Laurie starts talking about it.
Real. I mean, there was this man, but he was more like a monster, really. And they kept calling him Freddy, and he was so real.
What did he look like?
He had this dark brown hat, and his skin was terribly burned, and then on his right hand he had like these razor fingers.
He must be tripping.
No, and there was these little girls. And
okay,
they
it
were
was a bad
singing.
dream.
They were singing like
What I loved about this scene is that they're standing right in the middle of the hall, and everything's bustling around them. But as she's telling the story, people are slowing down and stopping to the point where eventually, when she's about done with her story, everybody is just kind of standing around listening. And again, I thought, oh gosh, Freddy's plan is so working. This whole hallway of high school kids is hearing this lore, and that's making them susceptible. It's a raw subject for Mark because his brother, I believe, was a victim of Freddy. And so he kind of has that history, and he knows a little bit more about it than the other kids do. And so he's kind of able to fill in some of the gaps there. But yeah, his older brother, it seemed to me had been blamed on suicide. And maybe he killed himself because he was being tormented by Freddy. I don't know. But Freddy definitely had something to do with it. So Mark is kind of familiar because of that.
Okay, that's it. Very good. So yeah, so then there's a scene in the school, and they take off again.
Bob Shea makes a little cameo as the principal there.
Yeah,
can you miss it? But he's there
for like 3 seconds. I thought that was funny. I thought maybe we'd see more of the principal. Maybe they shot a scene and it didn't work, and they cut it. But he just pops in, looks at everything, and then boom, we cut away to the next shot.
Yeah.
But anyway, so what happens then is that Will and Mark are going on their own little adventure to go do research, and they even go to the library at one point and find that newspaper articles are blacked out. That's how effective the town has been at keeping this a secret. Of course, blacking out the newspaper articles only makes things more suspicious. But
right.
That's what they find at the library. They're kind of putting two and two together that something is up.
There's a big rave that night in the cornfield, and the girls decide that they're going to go just to kind of get their minds off of what's going on. And they do, and it's this huge party, and everybody's drinking and dancing, and Gibb is particularly upset because it was, I don't even know if it'd be fair to call that guy who got killed in the bed her boyfriend. I think they were just messing around, but she's really upset, and she gets really drunk and wanders off into the corn by herself, where her dead lover, Trey, appears to her broken and looking very dead, and says something like, I've only been dead a day, and here you are out at a kegger getting plowed or something like that. And he says, come on. And he leads her through the cornfield to what looked like, I don't know, a silo or a grain mill, something like that. But once you get inside, very, very, very reminiscent of Freddy's boiler room. And that's where Freddy appears to her in his classic way, first in silhouette, showing the knives. And he plays a cat and mouse game with her in this boiler room that's, virtually identical to scenes that we've seen in his previous movies.
Yeah, I mean, the almost shot for shot, you can reference, oh, that's a shot from this movie, that's a shot from this movie.
Right.
But it's good. I mean, it's kind of nice because it's the Freddy that we know and love. It's the setting that we know and love, and I think it's very appropriate that the first, attempted kill anyway, if you don't count what happened in the street earlier, which was kind of a quicker blip, by Freddy is in this very iconic boiler room Freddy type setting. And, of course, she's asleep, so she is laying down in the cornfield, sleeping, and we see her body there and another guy come over, and it looks like he's going to take advantage of her while she is sleeping, which is really super creepy.
It was.
I mean, and even more now, so it's such a problem. I mean, it's always been kind of an issue, but this is kind of issue that's been brought to the forefront, I think, most recently. So it's funny because you can tell that this is a 2003 film because there's a rave scene. But in the same sense, it's remarkably current, I guess. I don't know. That's kind of weird to say about a kind of a rape scene, but to have a girl who is incapacitated at a party being taken advantage of by another guy is almost a modern twist on. It's just a modern element that just kind of got accidentally thrown in there, into a movie that's 13 years old. But
right, yeah. I mean, it's just something that's very fresh in our mind because it's such kind of a hot button issue right now. And I think because we have been so exposed to these types of incidents, and so many people are standing up and saying this isn't okay. I think it's just really fresh in our minds because I don't remember it being so troubling to me the first time I saw it. But this time I saw it, it felt very real and scarily so. So yeah, it was a hard to watch scene, and it's like maybe 5 seconds, and there's nothing graphic going on there, but you see what the intent is, and that's very uncomfortable.
It is, yet it provides this really interesting crossover element too, right? So you have this girl who's asleep, so she's in Freddy's world, she's susceptible to Freddy, but she's also having sex. I mean, she isn't having sex, but there's a sexual activity happening, right, which makes her a target for Jason. And that's exactly what happens. He bursts forward and basically stabs through both of them. And just as Freddy is about to kill her in the dream. And it's a really neat scene where here she is cornered inside this locker, essentially. And Freddy is coming in and about to get her when suddenly her chest just bursts forth in blood, and there's blood behind her, and she almost folds into herself. And Freddy's like, "What? She was mine!" And Jason stole his first kill away from him. And then goes on a bloody rampage through the whole party. Like, insane bloody rampage. Just comes out of the cornfields. He's on fire. And he's just hacking and slashing people right and left. And I have to admit, I mean, that was a pretty cool scene.
I love that scene. It's so over the top, and I would think that I would read that on paper and say that'll never work. It's way too over the top. It's so goofy, but it does work. I mean, he comes out. Somebody throws alcohol on him, and that's how he ends up on fire. But he comes out, and he's just, this guy that plays Jason in this movie, Ken Kersinger. I think is like 6'5", 6'6". I mean, he's huge. He's a huge guy, and to see him, fully ablaze coming out of this cornfield, wielding the machete, which is also on fire, and he just starts hacking away at these partygoers, and the body count is just crazy. Like, it's not like he just gets one or two kids. I mean, like, he's just like plowing through them, and I was trying to keep track up until this point, and I think that by the time this party is over, from the beginning of the movie, not even including the first kill, because the first kill was technically a dream, by the end of this party, Jason has already killed 13 people, and aside from the flashbacks, Freddy hasn't killed anybody.
Yeah.
and that I was really kind of surprised. I'm jumping ahead, but I'm going to get in the whole movie, the whole body count for the whole movie is, I think, 24. Freddy only kills one of those people. Every other person in the movie is killed by Jason, and I thought that was really. I was surprised by it. I thought that there would be more equal carnage on both sides, but there's not. Freddy only kills one person in the whole movie.
Well, you know what, though? It's really in keeping with, again, their aesthetic. Jason is the hack and slash guy who a victim is just a body to him, whereas Freddy is definitely more cold and calculating. And if you look at those two films, the film series, Freddy takes his time and is more creative, and there are a lot more effects involved in shooting that kind of movie. So for both creative and practical reasons, Freddy doesn't usually have as many victims overall as Jason does. And so, again, they really kept that balance. It seems unbalanced, but in reality is kind of balanced. And then, of course, you add on top of it the fact that the point is that Jason is killing all these people before Freddy can get to them, and that's another reason for it, obviously. And it becomes the perfect catalyst for Freddy to go against Jason to have their final battle at the end. And I thought that was actually pretty good. That was a pretty organic and natural way, because that was my big question going into this movie is, all right, you've got these two guys, but they're almost on the same team. Why would they be going against each other at any point? And so that becomes the reason then that Freddy gets frustrated with Jason. He's unleashed the monster. He can't retract. He's killing all the kids on Elm Street before he can have a chance to get to them.
Yeah, I thought that was really clever too, and it does then provide motive for Jason to want to take out his adversary because he's competition now, basically. The party, of course, breaks up. Everybody screams and runs. The girls, the remaining girls, Lori and Kia, they jump into Will's van, and then they're also joined by this new character who just pops in. I had never noticed this before, but like this character just comes in out of nowhere, and it's almost like we're just supposed to think he's been there the whole time. This guy named Bill. He's kind of the stoner guy. Is that his name, Bill? Yeah.
Yeah, he's like the Jay of Jay and Silent Bob.
Right. And then they've also got paired up with this nerdy kid, Linderman, who has a crush on Lori, and he and Kia have kind of a adversarial kind of relationship. But at this point, in my mind and in my notes, I kept referring to them as the Scooby Gang because they were just this ragtag group of kids who were running around together trying to figure out the mystery, fighting off the bad guys. Will takes Lori home, and Lori has a confrontation with her dad about what's really going on. And her dad is evasive and won't tell her, and tells her, just don't worry about it. I'll explain everything later. Will has told Lori that he believes that her dad killed her mom, and Lori confronts him about that, and he denies it and says, you don't understand. But anyway, Lori is upset and runs away and hooks back up with Will, and they decide that they're going to have to go find Mark because Mark is the one who knows about Freddy and he can help. Mark is back at his house by himself, and he's thinking about his brother. And as we come to find out that he's sleeping, he's dreaming. And so his brother appears to him and in like a pool of not a pool, a bathtub of blood. And this is so random, but the brother, who's only in it for a few minutes, is played by Zach Ward, who is Scott Farkas, the villain in A Christmas Story. And I always think it's funny when he pops up in things because I always remember him from that movie.
He's that iconic redhead. Like, it's hard to, even though he's much older now, he looks the same.
Yeah.
And he looks a little weird.
Yeah, right. So Mark becomes Freddy's first and only kill. Freddy says to Mark, "I need you to send a message for me." And Mark says, "Well, I'm not going to. I'm not going to do that." He says, "Well, I guess I'll have to do it myself." And so he sets him on fire. And meanwhile, Will and Lori have arrived, and they're looking in the window, but they can't get in. So they see all this happening. His back is set on fire, and they see slash marks going across his face. And eventually he's thrown against a wall and is dead. But they can see that on his back, the words "Freddy's back" have been burned into his back, which was kind of a funny little joke, but adequately frightening as well. And that's when the remaining kids all hook up at somebody's house, and they start talking about what they're going to do. And Stubbs, the new cop in town, just shows up randomly and is going to help them. Everybody's sitting around a table except Lori. Lori's sitting on the couch off a little ways. And they're talking. They're saying, what are we going to do? Will figures out Freddy's plan, that Jason was supposed to come back and get them all scared so that Freddy could come back. And Lori says, "Freddy died by fire, Jason by water. How can we use that?" And the people around the table start saying, well, maybe Freddy would accept a sacrifice. Who can we sacrifice? Oh, we'll have to sacrifice a virgin. And they all turn to Lori, and they're talking about her and teasing her in a very, very crass and uncharacteristic way. And they get up and they're going to tie her up. And then her father pops into the picture out of nowhere and says, "Don't worry, Daddy's here." And he like tries to start making out with her. Of course, she freaks out. And then it's revealed that it's Freddy. This is a dream. And she, as Freddy is trying to kiss her, she grabs hold of his ear. And meanwhile, her friends see that she's asleep and dreaming and struggling. They wake her up and she pulls the ear out of the dream. So we get that, that's something that has happened in most of the Nightmare movies, but they had to establish that it could happen here so that they could incorporate that into their plan, how to get rid of him.
And at least they had that scene, because to be quite frank, most of the rest of that scene I think is a little silly. I think one of the weaknesses of this movie is that all of the characters put two and two together way too easily and almost way too suddenly. There's a scene earlier in the van after Mark and Will have been to the library where they're trying to piece together why the memory of Freddy why this memory has been suppressed.
How come we were never allowed to call any of our friends, man? How come none of our friends ever called us? We were in a fucking quarantine, man. That's what Western Hills was for.
Well, even if all you're saying is true, then why didn't Freddy kill Laurie?
Maybe he's not strong enough yet. My brother said it's our fear that gives him his power.
Yeah, well, you sure as hell spread enough fear today at school.
You're right, they wanted to forget Freddy so they wouldn't fear him. What if I screwed up the town's plan?
Which is just such a silly line. So silly and ridiculous. And you get the same thing, I think, here, where they're piecing two and two together. Oh, Freddy sent Jason here in order to rekindle. I mean, there's so much they would have to know, and so many leaps of logic into fantasy world that they would have to do to be able to suddenly come up with that conclusion and have it be correct. It's just kind of dumb. But it moves the plot along, I guess.
It does. Well, and I think that that's why they had to do it that way. The initial cut of the movie was 2.5 hours long, and that, frankly, is just too long for this kind of movie.
Yeah.
So they brought people in to cut it down, and I imagine that we lost some exposition and some more, some investigating. So it seems like they're drawing fast conclusions. But to be fair, the movie does move at a quick pace. It never slows down, really. It doesn't lag anywhere, except maybe at this table scene, which is brief. But it keeps boom, boom, boom. Things are moving. They're always on the go. So yeah, I think it was an economy thing. They had to keep the plot moving forward. But yeah, some goofy dialogue in order to do that.
You had mentioned Laurie's dad earlier, and that's another thing I thought they did a great job, again, of incorporating some of that aesthetic in here where the adults and the parents are the problem. That is one of Wes Craven's hallmarks, really, of most of his movies, are that parents are evil, parents are the threat to the children. And you get that in this movie, too. Even though they're doing their best to protect the kids by suppressing these memories, they can't help but be a threat to them at the end of the day, because when Freddy does come back, he's going to come back with full force. And it's just that parental thing, by telling somebody something's forbidden, then that person just wants it more. And so you get this inevitability, this sense that this whole community is completely doomed. There's no way they can suppress this from the kids enough that the kids aren't eventually going to want to find out about it. And when they do find out about it, it's only after the fact that they're going to realize that was a mistake. But then Laurie's dad is just really mean about it. I mean, when she confronts him earlier in the house, he doesn't seem like the caring, loving kind of father here. Of course, he's being accused of murder, which we find out later wasn't the case at all. He's not comforting in trying to set the record straight with her.
Laurie, listen to me. You're upset. We both are. No, I think what you need now more than anything is to get some rest. Why don't I give you some pills and that'll help you sleep, and then we'll talk about it in the morning.
I don't want to sleep, Dad. I want to know why you've been lying to me.
We'll talk about it in the morning. Now do what I say. Laurie! 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 Open this door. Open this door!
And really, it's bad because he's kind of between a rock and a hard place. He can't set the record straight with her, because if he tells her the truth, then she's in even more danger. So it's a really odd and kind of cool bit of complexity that we're discussing here about this movie, how they made it work. And so as you say, I guess I'm willing to forgive some leaps in logic in order to move the plot along, because the script is pretty good otherwise, I think.
I think so too. Well, the kids, now that they know what's going on, they realize that they're not safe anywhere. They can't sleep because they might dream, and there's the physical threat in their waking life too. So they're not sure what they're going to do, but they realize sleep isn't the problem, dreaming is the problem. And Will knows about the Hypnocil, so they go to Weston Hills to get some Hypnocil to take. And there's this interesting scene in the hospital where they're looking for the Hypnocil. The stoner guy Bill goes off on his own to smoke a joint, and when he does, Freddy appears to him in the form of a caterpillar, like a demented version of the caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
And smokes a bowl with him, which is kind of funny. But then, and the other kids find this whole room lined with beds with teenagers in comas because they've overdosed on Hypnocil because the Hypnocil wasn't working on them. And Lori realizes that her dad is in charge of all this, and so she's disgusted by that. The caterpillar, and meanwhile, Jason shows up, breaks down the big metal doors, gets in, kills the guard. They know he's there. And the caterpillar, when he's stoned, Bill goes into the room with all the coma kids, and because he's, I guess, in a stoned daze or he's dreaming, I don't know, they tell him, we can't hear it because they're whispering, but they tell him to get the Hypnocil and dump it all down the sink. And he says, I can't do that. We need this. But then something drips down on his face, and he looks up, and the Freddy caterpillar is dangling up there, and it drops onto his face and forces its way down his throat. So now Bill is possessed, which you don't see a lot in the Nightmare movies, but in Nightmare 2, which they did acknowledge in that opening sequence, there's kind of a Freddy possessing the main character component. So it's not totally out of canon. So the other kids are running from Jason. They run into Bill in the hallway, who's just standing there, and they're trying to get him to come with them. But he says in Freddy's voice, "Let me take care of this, bitch." And they see, once they're behind him, that he's got these two enormous syringes of tranquilizer. And so he just allows Jason to approach him, and as Jason gets up close to him, he takes the two syringes and plunges them into his neck and plunges the tranq in. And it works, but not before Jason hacks him in half with his machete. But right after he does that, Jason falls over. He's out cold. And that's when the kids come up with their plan for how they're gonna fight Freddy with Jason.
Yeah, they're going to basically pit the two together. Lori puts two and two together that obviously these two are not friendly with each other. And so what they're going to do is they're going to get Jason back to his location at Crystal Lake to give him, I guess, the home court advantage. And Crystal Lake, thankfully, is just down the road. So there we solved that question.
Yeah. Who knew that these two things happened within 30 miles of one another all along?
Right. And then she becomes the bait in a sense. They go into the dream, and she's going to, again, this is from the first movie, she's going to pull Freddy into this world where he's vulnerable, but with Jason there as he's waking up from the tranquilizers, and they're going to duke it out in the real world. Jason obviously seems to be the superior one in this world, and so it makes a lot of sense that that's actually a pretty good plan. Always the problem with these plans, as we've seen in the other movies, is can they wake the person up out of the dream in time, at the right time, at all? And so that becomes a bit of an issue as well as they're going through it.
Well, what you mentioned about, Jason having the advantage in his world and Freddy having the advantage in his world, I really like the way that they played that up, because while Jason's out, he's susceptible to Freddy because he's unconscious. So Freddy can enter into his subconscious. And there's this really cool scene where they have a fight in the dream world. And in the dream world, Freddy totally has the upper hand. I mean, it's his world, his rules. He can virtually do anything that he wants. And so he's throwing Jason around like Jason's like a pinball in a pinball machine. You even get the pinball sound effects. He uses Jason's own machete against him and impales him with the machete, drops some big piece of boiler room equipment on him, and eventually he says, "Why won't you die?" Because no matter what he does, he won't die. But he also gets a glimpse just randomly. There's a place where water is falling, and Freddy's on one side of the sheet of water and Jason's on the other, and Jason's approaching, but right as he gets to the water, he stops. And Freddy says, "Oh, you are afraid of something." And so then Freddy makes it rain in the whole place, and it really reduces Jason to that deformed child, and he physically reverts in the dream world to that deformed child who had drowned. And Freddy takes his one of his knife fingers and kind of puts it into Jason's skull, and we really get to see the interior of Jason's mind. And it flashes us back to the Camp Crystal Lake, when Jason was a kid. And all of the kids are bullying him. One of them throws a burlap sack over his head, which is a total throwback to Friday the 13th Part 2, because that was what he wore before the hockey mask. Lori, eventually, they give her tranquilizer too, so she can go into it. And because this is where Freddy is, I guess, she enters into this world too, and she witnesses all these things going on. She witnesses the torment. She witnesses the kids pushing Jason into the lake and then leaving him there as he struggles. She runs up to the camp counselors, who are literally screwing on the on the porch of the camp, and she's like, "Aren't you going to do anything?" And the camp counselor turns around, and it's Freddy. And so Lori runs to try to rescue this drowning Jason as a child, and she tries to pull him out, but Freddy pulls him back down. And this is when there's kind of a funny scene in the car where, because Freddy now in the dream world, Freddy has Jason underwater. In the physical world, he's beginning to drown. So he's unconscious, but he's coughing up water. And they realize that somebody has to give him CPR, and that falls to Kia. And of course, she doesn't want to do it. It's kind of comical, her reluctance. But right before she's able to do it, he wakes up. Jason bolts up, and that frightens everybody, and they crash the van. Jason gets thrown out of the van. Everybody else is okay, but Lori is still unconscious. And they luckily crashed right next to the Camp Crystal Lake sign, so they are going to head into Crystal Lake. But they can't wake Lori up. And this is one of the coolest scenes I thought from the movie. As soon as Jason disappears, Freddy's underwater holding Jason down there. Lori's up on the dock. As soon as Jason disappears, Freddy looks up, and he just says, "You," and he leaps out of the water in this beautiful slow-mo shot where the water is trailing in this arc behind him, and it's the whole scene has gone completely red. And he confronts her there on the dock. And then they struggle. They end up back at her house, where he shows her what actually happened to her mom. It had actually been Freddy who had killed her mom. The dad was trying to save the mom, but it appeared from Will's perspective that the dad was the one who was actually stabbing her. But now she knows her dad didn't actually kill her mom, but and Freddy is tormenting her. He's hurting her. He's cutting her. He's molesting her. But there's nothing that she can do because they can't get her woken up. I don't know if it's because there was too much tranquilizer or if it was because of the crash. But they take her body, her physical body, into a cabin. They're trying to wake her up. And that's when Jason shows up. He breaks into the cabin, not intentionally, but knocks over some gasoline, sets the cabin on fire. So the fire is burning all around. At some point, Lori's arm falls into the fire, and just like burning woke Nancy up in Nightmare 1, this wakes her up, and she's holding on to Freddy at the time. So Freddy gets pulled into the real world, and that's where the final battle begins.
Yeah, and I think this is a lot more interesting to watch than the earlier confrontation between Freddy and Jason, and that's the problem I have with a lot of these kind of movies, like the superhero against superhero, is that they're both immortal in a sense. Nobody's gonna win. Nobody's gonna die. So when you're in the dream world and Freddy is fighting Jason, it just I don't know. I kind of tuned out a little bit, even though it was an interesting to watch scene. I was ready for it to be over. This, however, I was very curious to see how it was going to turn out, because here they are both in the real world, where again Jason does have the real advantage, and you're thinking, man, they're not going to kill Freddy off in this one, are they? There's some real tension. Plus, you have that fire and water, so we know that both of they're not just a danger to each other, but they each have that weakness. And it's kind of cool, actually, how that ended up. It poetically makes it work for this movie, almost like it was meant to be, even though the franchises were developed completely separately.
Right.
Yeah, and so here they are. They're on the dock in the lake, and they're fighting and things, and you're thinking, oh, how's Jason going to get in the water? How's Freddy going to get burned? And I thought that it was pretty interesting. It was a nice battle sequence, I guess, even though at the end of the day, they're not going to totally kill these characters off. You still want to see how they're going to get offed in this movie, because that's always an element of these movies anyway. How are you going to neutralize the threat? How are you going to put the characters to rest for a little bit longer?
Well, and I really like this scene because it could have been over super quickly. They could have battled it out really fast, but it doesn't. It goes on for a while, and it's all interesting. And they fight in the cabin in the fire for a while, and that's an interesting set piece. Then they get out into like this construction area where Freddy uses all this construction material to do some physical damage to Jason, because he's incapable of really doing much damage on his own in this world. And then, like you said, they go back and forth and back and forth. Kia gets killed in there somewhere. The young guy, the nerdy guy, dies. So Will and Laurie are really the only ones who are left, and they're witnessing all this. And Will is trying to get them in a boat and get them out of there.
Let's go. We can't help her anymore.
No, I'm staying.
Are you crazy? You got what you wanted. You pulled Freddy out. Now he's fighting Jason. Come on. What more do you want?
He killed my mother, Will. It was Freddy. My dad covered it up to protect me. He didn't do it. Look, he has taken everything from us. He has ruined both of our pasts. And I am not leaving until I see him die.
When Freddy and Jason are fighting on the dock, Laurie and Will get I guess it's boat fuel, and they spray the whole dock with it, and eventually set it on fire. So again, the fire is on the dock, but they're right on the water too. So it's both those elements, and it's a good fight. It's violent. They're using each other's weapons against them. They're really imposing serious physical damage on one another. Freddy gets his arm ripped off. Freddy's able to plunge Jason's machete deep into his torso. Eventually, the gas tanks explode, and they're both thrown out into the water. And Will and Laurie think that's it. They think they've won. But then here comes somebody walking towards them on the dock, somebody lumbering in big heavy shoes holding a machete. So you think it's going to be Jason, but it's not. It's Freddy. And he very menacingly looks at them and raises the machete, and then burst through his chest comes his own glove. And he looks down and realizes it seems that this is a mortal wound, or at least that he's severely compromised. Jason falls back into the water, and we presume that he's done for. Freddy drops the machete. Laurie stands up.
Welcome to my world, bitch!
And cuts his head off. That's pretty much where the movie in itself ends. It appears that they have both been defeated. And I liked it because it felt poetic that they offed each other, and they offed each other with the other's instrument of death. And I liked that. I liked that kind of a sense of it kind of being a tie there at the end. But then you get this end cap where we see this, mist on the lake. It's the next day, obviously. And you see Jason emerge, walking out of the lake, emerging from the lake. You can see that he's walking towards his cabin that we had visited earlier in the movie. And he's holding Freddy's head. And Freddy looks totally dead until it pans down to him, and he gives a little wink at the camera. And that's the end. What did you? I'm really interested to see what you thought of that ending.
I figured there'd be something like that at the end. You've got to appeal to both, I guess, both franchises in a way that if Jason's going to still be alive, Freddy's got to still be alive too. And so I really, nowadays, I don't expect these characters to actually be killed off. And I knew that there would be something at the end of the movie that would give a hint or a nod to leave it open for a sequel, either a sequel to Freddy vs. Jason or a sequel in either franchise. And so I wasn't surprised at that at all. I thought actually it was kind of a clever way of ending it, to be honest. And I guess that's something that, was it Sean Cunningham, the producer who directed the original Friday the 13th movie, kind of came up with that finally appeased everybody? Because I think there was some contention as to how this was going to end and who was going to beat who, and that seemed to be the one that everybody was happy with at the studios. Is that right?
Yeah, it is, and they actually planned multiple different endings. In one ending, an ending they actually shot, and this was the ending that they were planning on using. After the big battle, we cut to a scene between Will and Laurie where they are safe and comfortable, and they're in bed and they're fooling around, and it appears that they're going to have sex for the first time. But right before they do, Will grabs her by the throat and starts strangling her, reaches up his other hand, and it's the Freddy glove. And audiences hated it. They didn't understand. Was this a dream? Is Will now like some sort of like son of Freddy? Nobody got it. And frankly, I don't get it either. And so they scrapped that. There are some really interesting ones. There was one in the final battle where they were battling on the dock. The lake was going to start swirling as though there were a drain that had been plugged at the bottom, and the lake was going to totally drain to this hole in the bottom that was glowing red, and they were going to get Freddy and Jason were going to get sucked down in there, where they would continue fighting until a bunch of hooked chains shot out and stopped them both, and then Pinhead would arrive and say, well, what seems to be the problem? That would have actually made me really happy, but there was a rights thing, they couldn't really get it. Plus I guess the director thought that Pinhead was a little cheap compared to the other two. There was another similar one where they ended up down in hell, and Satan watched them battling out in this big gladiator pit, and it was supposed to be implied that the battle would go on forever. Lots of stuff like that, but eventually they went with the ending that they had. And I remember coming out of the movie thinking that it was kind of cheap, that it was kind of a cop-out. Watching it again now, I don't really feel that way so much. I thought that it was, I guess I didn't really want either of them to ultimately lose. Like you said, you don't want them to really be dead. You want there to be the chance that they could come back. And so, I think that it was like the whole movie. It's not perfect, but I can't think of a better way that they could have gone with it. And so I think that overall it was a success, especially if you read some of the ideas that were thrown around in development. There was some really far out stuff going on out there about how to get these two icons together. And some of it was really, really out there, and I think would have been really silly. I think that overall this worked really well.
Yeah, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed the movie and how less critical of it I ended up being than I thought I would be. Again, the dialogue is really quite silly. And again, that's just for economy. And to be fair, the dialogue in most of these movies is really silly.
Right.
So it's not out of character for those films anyway, to make giant leaps of logic and whatnot. Some of the movies are better than others. Another thing that is maybe a knock on this movie, but really couldn't be helped, is that Freddy is really best, I think, in shadow. Freddy is really best as the villain who's lurking behind, who comes out at these moments and shocks and surprises. And some of the more scary Nightmare on Elm Street movies are the ones where you see less of him. Or when you do see him, you don't see much of him. And in this film, I felt like you saw an awful lot of him for a really long time. So much so, almost as much in some scenes as you see the other human characters. So you get really good looks at his face, really good looks at him, and after a while, he seems to be a character instead of a supernatural threat. And again, that really can't be helped because of the kind of movie that you're doing, but it didn't really play to his strengths, I think, overall, as much as the film played to Jason's strengths of the sheer brutality of him walking around and killing in the real world.
I agree with you, and I also thought that it was interesting that they really kind of took liberty with Freddy's look. His look kind of altered throughout the course of the movie. There are some times when it would be the very traditional look. There are other times, like in some dream sequences, that scene that I talked about, him coming out of the water, where his face looks almost demonic, like almost like a different character. And it didn't bother me because the effects were cool and I liked it, but I thought it was interesting they took those liberties. It's interesting that you say that this ends up really kind of being more of a Jason movie, because Robert Shea really pushed for more Freddy stuff here. And I guess they ended up cutting out quite a lot of the Jason stuff. I mean, they eliminated entire characters, like Tommy Jarvis from some of the earlier movies was supposed to be a central character. All that stuff got cut. But I definitely agree with you that the balance, it does seem more like Jason gets more to do in this movie than Freddy does. And that's interesting that the movie comes from New Line. That's Freddy's house. But I actually thought the balance was good. I ended up liking it overall. I thought that it was well shot. I think as far as all of the entries in either of these franchises, this stands out as one of the strongest entries. Maybe not the strongest. I like New Nightmare better in the Nightmare series. But I thought that it was well shot. It was well directed. It was interesting to look at. I thought overall it was well done.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I think, especially in the Friday the 13th franchise, which I'm just more critical of anyway.
Right.
This is a standout, maybe the best in that series, in my opinion.
Maybe.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm like you, and I enjoyed this movie a lot more than I thought I would. After being disappointed by Alien versus Predator, I'm just wary of these ideas, these high concept movies where you're gonna take these two really frightening characters and turn them into superheroes and pit them against each other in the way that you would in a comic book. But this movie actually worked. And so for what it was, I was really pretty happy with it. It would be interesting to see a sequel.
Yeah, I don't think we'll get a sequel. I think Robert Englund's done. At least if we get a sequel, it won't be with Robert Englund. And I really don't even consider a Nightmare on Elm Street movie without Robert Englund a Nightmare on Elm Street movie. He is that franchise. So I don't know. They thought about a sequel. They thought about throwing Ash from the Evil Dead into the mix. They actually that went into comic book form instead. I've never taken a look at it, but I doubt we'll be getting a sequel, and I think that's okay. I think that it works well as a standalone piece in both of the franchises. And it's just kind of a little curiosity, a little oddity, something a little bit different, and it was fun to watch again. Thank you very much for listening to this episode, our 50th episode. Thank you especially to those of you who've been with us for the long haul. I know there's some of you out there who are listening every week and interacting with us.
Yes, a big shout out to Santosh, Karthik, Manuel, and Andy.
A lot of you all have been really good to us, and we appreciate it. I've been having a lot of fun. I think Todd has too. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you all for listening to us. If you like this podcast, you can find us on Stitcher. We're on iTunes, Facebook, Google Plus every once in a while. We're out there. And if you do like it, please share it with your friends. We love to hear from you guys. So feel free to comment, make suggestions. And until next time, I'm Craig.
And I'm Todd.
With Two Guys and a Chainsaw.